terms of your members in respect of Euratom?
Yeah, in addition to what David was saying, the underpinning nature of the regime, so there's two broad areas that are important from the industrial perspective. Firstly, the research for fusion research funding comes through Euratom, and the work that happens at Culham on JET, and that's important industrially, not just in relation to JET, but also ITER in France, where there are a number of UK nuclear industry companies who have got significant work from that and are involved in that. Around about €500 million equivalent has been let to either British companies or British companies in joint ventures with others on that. But more widely, the common market, as it were, in nuclear goods and services is vitally important. As David said, it's an international industry. The supply of components, in relation to how you get the fuel, all those things are underpinned by the Euratom framework that exists, both to facilitate the cooperation agreements between the Euratom countries and third parties, and also in terms of the relationships within that group of countries. So, for example, getting components from one country to another that's all tied within that Euratom framework. So it's really important to the way in which the industry functions, both in relation to the ongoing generation, decommissioning, and also future new build as well.
Thank you. Dinty.
Yeah, I mean, the treaty underpins community activities relating to the full nuclear fuel cycle and industrial, medical and research applications in terms of the rules of protection, the best practice, etc. So it's part of everyday life in the nuclear sector. The supply and exchange and transfer of nuclear materials across borders is probably one of the most important parts that is made easy by the Euratom Treaty, both within the EU and between any of the member states, including us and third parties. So the nuclear cooperation agreements that exist are vital to international trade. From a research angle, the radioactive materials that are used in research, in medicine, etc., are all covered by the Euratom agreements. Movement of the best intellectual talent within Europe is made easy by the treaty. Access to the very high-cost facilities that are not within the UK, but which UK researchers use on a daily basis, are also important, and leverage for funding of what would otherwise be very expensive projects.
Thank you. Rupert, anything to add?
Thank you. Obviously, everything that my friends say is correct, but there is a distinction that needs to be drawn. Euratom is simply a vehicle through which many of our international obligations are transferred into English law through the EU. And if you were to take those away and rely upon just the international treaties, only some of the things that are contained in Euratom would be removed. So cooperation is in Euratom and isn't part of the international treaties with Europe, that is. The R&D and investment vehicles and the European common market would disappear. But still the obligations that ultimately, if we come out of Euratom, we're going to have to show we comply with, rest independently, exist independently of the Euratom. And what I'm anxious to do as a lawyer, as it were, is try to find some precision as to what obligations already exist and what have to be replaced when the Euratom Treaty ceases to exist, and how that affects our business relationships with other nuclear partners.
And that's an important point, isn't it? Which is in respect of, by all accounts, and we've heard it today, Euratom is important to the UK nuclear industry. But in terms of that thick international web of cooperation, can't we just do this through the International Atomic Energy Agency?
Well, we can with respect to some aspects of what is covered in safeguards, safety, etc. But in order to move material around, you have to have bilateral treaty or other agreements with every single state with whom we do business, whether it's for research purposes or trade purposes. And so, there is a plethora of international agreements that would have to be struck that almost mirror those that are already in place with Euratom before we could even begin to move not just material but intellectual property, services, anything in the nuclear sector. We would be crippled without other things that were in place.
Okay. Anything else to add?
Yes, I'll add the context in relation to your point in relation to the International Atomic Energy Agency. We clearly engage in a big way with the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the IAEA have conventions which we have treaty obligations to comply with from a UK perspective, which the ONR actually works alongside government to exercise. Those conventions enable us to collaborate and cooperate on a global basis with essentially world players from a nuclear regulatory perspective. Those conventions cascade down then into European space, into the directives, and indeed the directives almost mirror the conventions that the IEA has put in place. But the key point about our collaboration and cooperation in Europe is that it brings together the European community, and this is mirrored elsewhere in the world with an Asian community and indeed a North American community. And the collaboration and cooperation works very effectively within those smaller groupings. The UK currently, as a member of the European community, is a member of the European Nuclear Safety Regulators Group, and the Chief Inspector and myself are members of that group. We wouldn't be able to continue, there isn't precedent for us to continue as members of that group should we move away from Euratom. But what there is another group within Europe called the Western European Nuclear Regulators Association, which works alongside NSREG as its technical support arm, and we would continue to be able to have membership of that from a collaborative perspective in Europe. So that is indeed a positive. And I think what I would cite here is that there are other countries, notably Switzerland here actually, who clearly aren't a member of the European community, but who still actively engage within Europe. So there are possibilities there, but it just makes it a little bit more difficult, and it means we have to try a bit harder, and we have to actually work on maintaining our influence within that European grouping.
Okay. I think that's a really important point about the, what, and as Sue has said as well, what you would need to replicate, what currently exists if you come out of Euratom, you'd need to be able to put in place, because there are a whole range of nuclear cooperation agreements with different countries and different states with varying scope, and some of them will need to have certain aspects of them have to be renegotiated or redrafted, and there is obviously, if the intention is to give notice to leave Euratom in the sort of 2-year at the same time as the Article 50 process, then that gives a relatively short period of time to be able to get lots of things in place at the same time, as there will obviously from a government perspective be a lot going on.
And that's an interesting point, Tom. Is that what the timetable will be? At the same time that Article 50 is triggered, does that automatically mean that we're giving notice to leave Euratom, or is that a separate process?
No, there's a separate, and I think Rupert will be able to add more to this, but there is a separate process in the treaty. But what the government have said in relation to the bill currently going through Parliament and the notes to that is that they would intend to signal that at the same time. So, but I don't think it's an absolute requirement. I don't know really.
So, I mean, absolutely not. One of the reasons I think I was invited to give evidence is that I've been writing articles saying the Euratom Treaty has an independent legal personality. It is not automatically brought to a close when you exercise Article 50 in the EC as it's drawn. If you wanted to, if there were the political will to, there's no question that legally you could stay in Euratom for some time or forever if you were prepared to continue to operate with the EU and have a representative on the Commission and abide by the European Court of Justice, which of course is probably politically impossible. But in terms of achieving transition, it may be that if we go to the European nuclear community and say we don't think we have to do this at the same time as we operate Article 50 of the EC Treaty, they may agree, and we may be able to arrive at transition a period that allows us to make these changes that we need to make in order to continue our business. It's just the little point I want to make is that unlike any other of the arrangements that this committee has been discussing, such as the emissions trading system and so on, if we don't get this right, business stops. There will be no trade. And that's a very important distinguish between all the other things that are being discussed. If we can't arrive at safeguards and other principles that allow compliance to be demonstrated, no nuclear trade will be able to continue.
And that means nuclear power stations have to shut down?
Ultimately, when their fuel runs out, yes.
Okay, thank you. Michelle?
Sorry, can I just ask one question before we go on to safety? I mean, you just clarified that. What you're telling the committee is what you put in your briefing notes that we got via the NIA, is that we don't legally have to trigger the withdrawal of Euratom. Now, we don't have to. You don't feel that because we're triggering Article 50 that we have to trigger Euratom. Are you saying that clearly?
I am saying that absolutely clearly. It has a separate legal personality.
Yeah. But do you believe that the government lawyers have been given different advice?
Well, it depends what question you ask.
No, I'm asking you.
So I don't know what they were asked. If the political will is to make it appear that you have to go forward and operate it at the same time, then the answer is yes. But if they would say, is there any way that we can avoid operating Article 50 in relation to Euratom, then the answer is yes.
Because the reason I asked that question is, doesn't it also apply to other treaties that we're involved in Europe and our cooperation on policing, etc.?
It does not, because it's specifically the fact that the history of Euratom, which started at 1957 with the steel and coal, etc., is integrated closely with the ECT and the EJCE, so EFCE rather. And so it is written as a single arrangement under 106A of the Euratom Treaty that implies that you have to exercise the determination of the same period. I'm saying if you read it correctly and you push it, there is a very serious legal case that would be sustainable in an English court that you do not have to operate it at the same time. That's not the question that the government lawyers were asked, obviously. Otherwise, it would not have appeared in the bill to come out of to operate Article 50 in the way that it did.
But it's because of the European Court of Justice.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a political issue, not a legal issue.
Okay, thank you. Michelle?
Before I move on, just to continue this discussion, because this strikes me as entirely fundamental, and the point you're making about the politics versus the kind of legal thing. And just following that through then, that means that if they still insist that that should be the case because of what you say about the politics around it and this kind of potential kind of floor if they trigger it at the end of it, my worry then would be from the whole range of gamut there's currently structural things in place, not just to trade, but obviously the sort of safety element. What are your concerns if it did get to that case, which I find it hard to believe that we would kind of sleepwalk into that, but what are the immediate risks based on your expertise that would present?
Well, that's exactly what we are doing. We are sleepwalking into it. So David Senior and ONR will tell you that they can put in place the physical requirements to ensure that our obligations under treaties other than Euratom, so it's the Civil Nuclear Safety Treaty, the treaty about looking after radioactive waste and so on and so forth, which I've given you a list of, can be complied with. And that is the case. Given the resource and given the time, ONR will ensure that there is no actual danger. The point is that in order to operate your nuclear cooperation agreements and trade agreements, you need to demonstrate compliance. And in order to demonstrate compliance, you have to have a procedure that is at least as robust as currently works under Euratom. And then you need to persuade your counterparty. And the counterparty will also be politically motivated. So if you go to the United States, for example, to have their equivalent of the current arrangements to Euratom, and it's just called a Section 123 agreement, then they will be motivated to agree something as quickly as possible, assuming we're friends and all the rest of the politics of it. When you look back in history, and we got to that point, there was 2 years when there was no nuclear trade possible with the US because Congress hadn't agreed the 123 agreement. That will happen in multifarious arrangements of the 51 treaties that I've given you, of which 5 or 6 are critically important to the continuation of nuclear business.
And you mentioned earlier English law, of course, given a number of installations in Scotland and therefore under Scots law jurisdiction. No, I'm not taking any offence, but what I'm pointing out that clearly then that would introduce an additional level of complexity because of what you're saying from your perspective as an English lawyer would equally well apply what then will fall under jurisdiction considerations under Scots law.
That's right.
Where obviously there's another political
And so different
consideration
people have
as
different
well.
commercial concerns, don't they?
Yeah.
Those that are building the nuclear power stations want to be certain that they can get their components, they want to be certain they can get their personnel, they want to be certain they can get their fuel in the future. When we come out of Euratom, if we haven't succeeded in agreeing transition arrangements, we will not be able to do any of those things. And my fundamental point, and that's what the panel is telling you, my fundamental point is that's probably not legally necessary. It's being driven by politics.
Right, okay. This is going to be a very interesting session. So in terms of the International Atomic Energy Agency and its kind of role going forward, I'm interested, or rather, how we meet those we comply with that. I'd like to get a bit more sort of thoughts from you about, you know, some of the considerations, staffing, how it might be implemented, standards, safety, obviously. Just as a nice sort of general question, first of all, how do you think it might work?
Well, I mean, David is probably better.
I'll lead on this one, actually. The UK has treaty obligations with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which I've already described as part of the United Nations. So those treaty obligations are primarily through what are known as conventions. So there are two key conventions there, the Convention for Nuclear Safety and the Joint Convention on Spent Fuel and Radioactive Waste. So the Convention on Nuclear Safety actually focuses on mainly nuclear power plants, the operation of nuclear power plants and their safe operation. The Joint Convention focuses more on the management of spent fuel, i.e. the fuel that has been used up in a nuclear power station and then needs to be managed accordingly as a waste or indeed recycled back into the nuclear fuel cycle, together with the management of radioactive waste. So there are various articles associated with the conventions, and we as a nation, and ONR discharges this on behalf of government, actually have to submit a report every 3 years to demonstrate compliance with those conventions. So we have a very strong focus and a very strong relationship with the International Atomic Energy Agency. To add to that, the International Atomic Energy Agency also put in place safety requirements, they put in place safety standards. So we then translate those safety standards, those safety requirements into our legislation, into our regulations, such that we can actually demonstrate that we are actually meeting international good practice, meeting those high standards of nuclear safety expected internationally. And indeed, we quite often set the pace there. We're often leading those discussions, putting in place those safety standards via the safety committees, and play a big part in those processes. In relation to how that then mirrors into Europe, I've already mentioned the directives. There's 3 directives. There's a nuclear safety directive, which is pretty similar to the Convention on Nuclear Safety. There's the Spent Fuel Radioactive Waste Directive, which says, I've already described what that does. And then there's a Basic Safety Standards Directive, which essentially is focused on looking after people, individuals, from the effects, the potential harmful effects of radiation. So we have to demonstrate compliance with those directives, and indeed we submit a report on a triennial basis, a 3-yearly basis again, to demonstrate compliance with the directives.
Okay, I mean, and that's very helpful for me, thank you.
Absolutely what David said. I mean, coming out of Euratom would not mean that we were any less safe or any less compliant with any overarching international agreement, because the Euratom agreements are driven by the IAEA's global oversight of nuclear energy. The issue is the timing rather than the absolute demonstration of safety. Much of the equipment that enables us to demonstrate compliance is not ours, it's Euratom's. You know, the cameras, the high-cost equipment, the labs, etc. that do that are not ours. The people are not ours, they're Euratom's. And so the translation of that activity and the equipment into IEA space or national space demonstrated to IEA will have to take place. So it's about buying time to put all the right things in place and make sure that that we're compliant and therefore still able to trade.
So presumably, then, what you're suggesting about a transitional arrangement, that's adding weight to that perspective, because it takes time to train staff, to procure equipment, get it tested.
Or even
Or
if
just
you're
to
going to
transfer, transfer,
Yeah.
even if it was just a transfer.
Because there are a number of other countries what they conform to IAA standards. They're not within a Euratom or a similar block. They do it themselves, but they've obviously got the infrastructure to be able to do that, and we don't currently have that. And that's done through Euratom, so we'd have to replicate that in some way.
Okay, no, that's a lot clearer, thank you.
Could I just elaborate a minute on the point that Sue has just raised there, because it is quite different actually, and what Sue has just been describing there is essentially a safeguarding arrangement and safeguarding obligations that we have internationally, and it's quite different than nuclear safety actually. So as a nation, what we're obliged to do is to ensure that nuclear materials, i.e. fissile nuclear materials, uranium, plutonium, thorium, if it's used in nuclear fuel cycles, is looked after properly and is maintained within the civil nuclear programme and doesn't find its way into other uses, such as weapons, for instance. So in relation to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, we're obliged to actually have arrangements in place so that we can demonstrate that that material is being looked after properly. So that's the first angle of safeguarding. The second angle of safeguarding is in relation to, and Rupert's already mentioned it, the ability to transfer nuclear materials between countries and actually conduct nuclear business. And this is where the nuclear cooperation agreements come into place, and safeguarding of material between countries. So for instance, if material is being utilised to manufacture nuclear fuel in the UK, and as part of that process takes place, and it does, for instance, in Germany or the Netherlands, then there has to be safeguarding of nuclear material between those countries. So there's two angles to safeguarding. The key point here is that safeguarding is actually discharged on the UK's behalf by through Euratom by the European Commission. So within the UK at the moment, the European Commission provides the safeguarding regulatory activity, which then reports into the International Atomic Energy Agency. So if we leave Euratom, and if we leave that arrangement, then the UK has to set up its own arrangements for the safeguarding of nuclear material. And we've been discussing very actively with officials in BEIS what that may or may not look like in a post-Euratom scenario. It's not been fully worked through yet. We've explored a number of options in relation to what that may or may not look like, and the term that we use here is it's a state system of accountancy and control, an SSAC. We would have to set up what is known as an SSAC within the UK, and we've been actively discussing arrangements for that with officials in the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Thank you.
Yeah, and so just a last week question then. If it were the 2 years, setting aside your excellent points that you've made, how confident are you feeling that the deadline could be met if it were within 2 years?
In respect of setting up an SSAC, that will be quite challenging in a 2-year period. We have actually had discussions with officials in BEIS in relation to what would be possible within a 2-year period, and what we would need to put in place. There are 3 elements to an SSAC, a State System of Accountancy and Control. The first element is basically a management system that enables us to track and keep a handle basically on nuclear materials that are in the UK or indeed are crossing our national boundaries.
Yeah, so what you're saying,
we would have to put inspectors in place.
But what you're saying is what you need to do. My question is, how confident are you that if the 2-year trigger period, there's an insistence that that's adhered to, how confident are you that all the required mechanisms can be put in place by that timescale? I saw you're nodding, you're shaking your head.
For the safeguards area, which David has just been describing, then possibly, and he's in a better position to judge than I am. But for the nuclear cooperation agreements, which are the things that enable trade, movement of materials, whether they be fissile or not, I don't think that's possible. Definitely not.
Once ONR have got those safeguards in place, you're at the starting point where you can start discussing with your cooperative partners abroad whether or not you are compliant. And while in theory, obviously, because the system is at least as good as we're currently running, we're compliant, if there isn't a political or commercial will on the other side, it won't happen. And there are people like Germany, there are people like the Netherlands who want it to fail for their own reasons. So Urenco starts working in Germany, not in England. Those sorts of questions will inevitably mean that these 51 agreements which I've given you will not be capable of satisfactory conclusion in most cases within any short period after safeguards have been completed.
Yeah, and so it's again a key point you make with that kind of spirit of willingness given the range of potential negotiating variables, not just in this sector, right across the piece. Okay, major challenge.
In respect to the work we've done so far, our position is that we would only be in a position in a 2-year period to actually put a basic arrangement in place from a safeguarding perspective. It wouldn't be identical to what we have with Euratom at the moment. I'm not suggesting it needs to be, but it would be challenging. It's challenging in relation to recruitment of resource. It's challenging in relation to actually having the infrastructure in place, the cameras, the seals, everything that's required from a safeguarding perspective, and knowing whether or not we could utilise what is already there at the moment, which is Euratom property, or whether or not we would have to replicate our own. It is challenging, very challenging, and we could only put a basic offering in place. Thank you.
You've been very, very clear on how difficult and challenging it's going to be to get nuclear cooperation agreements if we were to come out of Euratom. And, you know, I totally agree with what the panel has been saying. But the cooperation agreements are mostly a market route for third-party countries. But when Euratom was set up, and I've read your notes and others people, so if I'm wrong, I'm trying to quote your briefing note you gave at second reading, or I got from you at second reading, Rupert, is that they also set up a common market. And what my question is, because I don't want to rehash the arguments we've had about the EU referendum, but many people who wanted to leave the EU wanted to really have a common market. And now we've been told, when it comes in general, that we're going to come out of the single market. So my question really to the panel is, can we coexist as outside Euratom and still have a common market within Europe?
Short answer, no.
For nuclear?
Obviously, there's the single market, and that works under the European Treaty.
Yes.
Under Euratom, there is a different, but effectively intended to have the same effect of an open market for nuclear materials within the EU zone. Because when it was conceived, it was believed there'd be a shortage. And so they're trying to make sure that the fuel for nuclear generation is available all over.
Okay.
If you leave Euratom, that, together with every other protection that we've described to you, stops.
Okay, so what does that mean for planned new build plants in the future, Tom, from your members? What concerns do they have?
Well, the concerns that our members have, particularly those involved in that, some of that activity, is that there isn't what the Prime Minister said she wants to avoid in terms of there being a cliff edge or a disorderly exit, that the things that you need to put in place to replicate as much as you can are in place before you leave, effectively. So, for example, when you talk about nuclear cooperation agreements, one of the key ones of those is with the USA. That is currently done through the Euratom framework. It's a legislative requirement of US law that there is an NTA in place before to enable any sort of activity to happen. And there is technology which might have originated, although the vendors may be from different places, may have originated in the US and which will be caught within that. So there are so it's about making sure those things are in place. And if they're not, there is potential for disruption in quite a lot of activity, and that's the key point about this idea or thinking about this in terms of transitional arrangements or how you trigger it, to make sure that you don't end up in a position which the government said they don't want to end up in. The government have said very clearly they want to ensure that not only do we accord with international standards and there isn't any dilution standards in terms of safeguarding, but also that it doesn't disrupt activity for nuclear activity in the UK. So if that is the case, then we've got to make sure those things are in place, and that, I think, points you back to the same place, which is about making sure you've got transition arrangements in place, or you negotiate those, so you don't trigger something with an artificial short deadline that leaves you in that position, that potential vulnerability.
Do you see any benefits about coming out of Euratom? I mean, is there something we could do as a country that is not bound by some of the rules of Euratom? For instance, you mentioned, David, the Swiss arrangements. I mean, are there arrangements that could be put in place, pretty swiftly, that avoids the cliff edge you're talking about?
You mean the Swiss position of being associated to Euratom, but not in
rather
it?
than
But that association is very limited.
Okay.
Just to the programmes around fusion research, and that runs out in 2018, I think.
And
as well,
it's dependent on there being a signatory to the Croatian agreement, which means they have to allow free movement of people in relation to nuclear.
Okay.
Very quickly, if you want to.
Yeah. But
Albert, do you want to come in on that?
I do want to get the other side of it, if there's any positive.
When the Swiss tried to renegotiate their relationship with regards to free movement, their position on Euratom was downgraded. So, the clear implication is that, trying to renegotiate free movement means there is a price to pay with your relationship with Euratom.
I mean, also the Swiss would have in place, because they've been a nuclear generator, using nuclear electricity for many, many years. They've had arrangements out with the Euratom arrangement under the IEA and the relevant agreements and treaties to
with
allow
very
that to
clear
happen.
implications for anything that we try to renegotiate in terms of a relationship with Euratom after renegotiating our relationship with freedom of movement. So, yeah, very helpful.
And the question I'm asking is that there is a Norwegian agreement with the single market, subject to the caveats that you said. Is there a third way, the Swiss option, that could help or give some opportunities to the British nuclear industry, is what I'm asking?
Well, a lot of this will come down to negotiation, and obviously there are two parties in that negotiation, and there's a wider context to those negotiations that your inquiry and many others will be looking at. I think there is technically provision to allow associate membership of Euratom. There isn't any full associate member. There is a provision, I've forgotten the treaty clause, which enables that. But I think the reality is that this will come into the scope of a negotiation between the wider negotiations between the EU and the UK. There are ways in which, for example, on safeguarding, you may be able to do things that would enable a transitional arrangement. That some of that may be continue to be done by Euratom, and you may do a charge back or various other things that you could do whilst you're establishing your own regime. So it's about pragmatism. There's probably lots of things you could try to do to make it work. What we're, I suppose, collectively warning about is the potential for there to be a very hard 2-year deadline, during which 2-year period, if it's done in the same time frame, there are lots of other things that the government has got to deal with and negotiations that have to be undertaken that could leave us in a position where some of these things aren't in place and we aren't able to continue.
Does the government get that, Tom?
We'd have to ask the government if they get it. They've been told it several times in lots of different fora, and I don't think they could say that they haven't heard it.
No, I know you don't speak for the government, but I've raised this with the Secretary of State, and I've raised it in debate here. And the reality is, they think that things are going to be okay, and I don't have those assurances from you as a panel today.
There's a lot to do to get anywhere near.
Just to finish your question on the government, because we were asked to brief the Labour peers when they moved the second reading in the House of Lords, and many amendments were proposed specifically about Euratom, from the extreme position where I'm saying don't trigger, to the position where you don't allow it to be triggered until you've got an exit route. All of them were defeated, every single one. In the Commons.
Thank you.
Is it in both then?
In the Commons.
I thought it was the Lords and Commons, but...
I'll bring you in for a brief question.
Just very briefly, it's really to follow up on Albert's point. So talk a lot about the value of Euratom, and the degree of the transition. One question to each of you very quickly, please. Albert asks, what positives can you think of for when we leave Euratom?
There
David,
are positives.
could I just start with this end, because you've said a lot, Mr. Can I start with David?
He was going to answer.
Well, I want to start, but I want each person to answer, because we get panel after panel,
Okay.
and people focus on the problems, they focus on the difficulties, and then we have time to think about what the sunny uplands are going to be. Now, there may be no sunny uplands, But I'd like to know, these are 4 experts, they obviously have different points of view. David?
I think the area I would focus on is essentially the directives. I've already explained to the committee that the directives are essentially mirroring the conventions from the International Atomic Energy Agency. So if we relinquish our obligations with Euratom, then we wouldn't have to legally comply with the directives. So there would be a reduced burden there. I'm not suggesting that that burden is huge, but there would be a benefit to the UK in that we wouldn't have to actually comply legally with those directives.
Thank you. Tom?
I think potentially once you've got all your different agreements in place, then you're in a very different position, and so the way that may be able to help to develop some of those wider relationships and international trading relationships can happen through those NCAs. But I suppose that I'm coming back to the same point. It's about there being the gap, because you need to replicate so much of that. So potentially once you've replicated it, though, when you've got nuclear cooperation agreements with the US, with other places,
the trading
that potentially opens up some opportunities.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with Tom there. It may open up other opportunities for international research collaboration that would otherwise be more challenging for us, but that requires associated funding. And it may well reduce some, but probably not very much, in terms of the bureaucracy associated with compliance. But the one thing that we must always be aware of is that the nuclear sector becomes under global scrutiny, and what we can't afford to do is be seen as deficient in anything to do with compliance.
Thank you.
There are a series of bureaucratic changes where we go to the Commission at the moment where we will no longer need to go to the Commission, such as justification, such as data requirements, such as investment notification. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and it's much like the whole Brexit question, if you wait long enough, then there are obviously many opportunities in the globe. So we could be working with Korea, we can be working with China, we can be working with all of those other nuclear nations successfully and effectively, but not through Euratom. So there are positives, but it's going to be a pretty difficult decade, and it's trying to avoid the cessation in trade that we're concerned about, not about where we are in 10 years.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it very much.
Anna.
Thanks. I'd like to focus on research and development in particular, if I may. And I'll start with a sort of very generic question, which is how you think leaving Euratom will affect research and development in this industry. Well, and I'll go to Sue.
We benefit hugely in terms of leverage at the moment from being participants within the European Union's Euratom programme. The biggest part of our benefit comes to fusion through European funding for the facilities that are at Culham, the JET facility, the Joint European Torus at Culham, and the benefits that have flown in very large contracts to build the research equipment associated with the big project in France, the ITER project. Hundreds of millions of pounds worth of business have flowed to European companies, to UK companies, to build the one-off bits of very high-grade equipment that goes into that sort of facility. We gain a few millions per year to supplement our Research Council's programme on the wider fusion research that goes to the UK AEA at Culham and in UK universities. On the fission side, we benefit by being able to participate in the technology platforms that flow through the European Union's Euratom programme, the ones on geological disposal, the ones on radioactive waste management, and particularly. The ones on new fission reactors, the next generation fission reactors, we actually don't benefit from very much because not much money flows into that from Europe. Because the one peculiarity of Euratom is that it requires unanimity to approve the research budget. And when you have nations that are not supportive of the nuclear mission within Europe, such as Austria, then it is almost impossible to get research funded through Euratom to do with next generation systems unless there is a safety angle to it. So that's pretty small beer in the overall term. But funding and leverage on our own investment is vital, but movement of people within the sector is also extremely vital from a research standpoint. If you look at most of the MSc courses that have a nuclear component within the UK at the moment, you will find very often a majority of overseas students, the majority of whom are European students. Our PhDs and postdocs, many are European. Many of our lecturers and indeed our professors in the nuclear world are European. So the intellectual horsepower coming from the wider European member states into the UK, adds huge value. So we're not just looking at volume here, we're also looking at intellectual horsepower and quality long term, because having UK students and lecturers and professors along with European counterparts make sure that we're at the highest level of quality in the sector.
Great, thank you. Would anyone else like to
Just as Sue touched on, but that has an industrial benefit as well. There are a number of companies, UK companies, that, particularly in relation to JET, that are working at Andanita. So on robotics, for example, a whole range of very advanced technology where you've got UK companies involved in that. If that was closed off, then that would make a significant impact on them as well.
One of the final point that I didn't mention was we get access to the very expensive facilities of the JRC, the Joint Research Centres within Europe, in Karlsruhe in Germany, Ispra in Italy, and at the facilities in the Netherlands and Belgium. We don't have those facilities in the main. So our researchers can go and spend time in those very expensive assets, and which we would then not have to invest in. Similarly, we get European researchers coming into the UK assets that we have to get leverage on both sides. That would be more difficult to achieve out with Euratom.
Thanks. And is there any way that we can continue, do you think, to participate in these sorts of programmes to support the IETR programme in France outside of Euratom, or do you think this is okay?
It will no doubt be possible long term, because the big ITER project has nations other than European nations within it, and the same for other aspects of research, but it will take time. We're probably going to go through a huge period of perturbation before we actually get to a stable situation going forward.
Thank you. And can I ask about the project in Culham as well? Obviously, it's kind of cutting edge for us. Will leaving Euratom have a profound impact on that site? But also conversely, do they need us and that facility as much as we need them? And is there potentially some, I don't like using kind of the idea of bargaining chips, but do we have something there to offer in terms of the expertise and the facility that we have there to help negotiations?
Well, certainly that facility is seen as an essential international facility. And so the European partners know how valuable it is. But it will come to its end of life at some time in the run-up to ITER becoming operational. So at some point, the JET facility will close in the future because it will have outlived its useful technological value.
Thank you. Much of ITER is, my understanding is that the work that's happening at JET will inform what will happen at ITER. So there is, you can see where there's a potential synergy, and the contract on JET is 2018. The funding, current funding, runs out, and prior to the start of the publication of the notes in the bill which mentioned Euratom, I know that UKAA, who run Culham, were in negotiation and discussion with European institutions around an extension of that to 2020. Now, obviously, this will potentially make that harder, that discussion. But there is a sense, and there's a reason why you would want, if you were looking at from an ITER perspective, you would want JET to continue to that period. But it adds to this wide range of different things that all have to be negotiated, agreed, discussed at the same time, obviously in the wider context.
And my final one, Chair, if I may, is actually focusing on the funding element, which we've sort of discussed. But I think it's Euratom provides £9 million to the UK industry. What are the alternatives for this kind of funding? Are we exploring? Are there any options available for us to get that kind of resource to the UK outside of Euratom?
Well, that's specific for fusion work from the Fusion Association, part of the European Euratom budget. We're talking about here basic fundamental science, which is applicable to the fusion mission long term. I mean, that would be the same sort of science that would come through our Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, or our STFC, our Science and Technology Facilities Research Council. So if we don't get it from there, in order to pursue that type of research, then we would be looking at competing with completely different parts of the research landscape within UK space.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pete.
Thank you, Chair. You've been so fantastically comprehensive in your answers that you've covered many of the preliminary questions that I already had. So I'm going to cut straight to the chase with two questions, if you don't mind, Chair, and then I'll wrap up. Tim Yeo, because I know he's already looking at his watch already, which is not a great sign when he's starting your questions. Tim Yeo, who's chair of the New Nuclear Watch Europe, has suggested that we set up a new pan-European organisation which would bring in cooperation from countries outside of the EU, almost as a replacement for Euratom. What does the panel think of this? Presumably you've read his suggestions, presumably you have a view as to whether it's feasible or not, or what the impact would be, and whether it would be a potentially good vehicle for Britain. David, if you could start with you, and if any other panellists want to...
Just in response to that proposal, I would answer that in respect of the Western European Nuclear Regulators Association group, which I've already talked about before. That was set up a number of years ago from a European perspective, but the standing that it's actually grown to has acquired has actually now resulted in other countries worldwide becoming observers of that group, and indeed the Canadians and the Japanese have recently become observers to that group. So what I'm saying here is there's no reason why a European group couldn't broaden out basically into a more global group and enjoy the benefits of those interactions actually, because as we've all pointed out earlier on in the discussions, nuclear is a global industry. We work to international standards, so there's no reason why these groups should remain purely European. There are benefits to other countries actually interfacing with them, but it just depends how they're set up, what their terms of reference are, how they're actually
Dame Sue, I think you want to come in now? Could you just, in your answer, could you cover this new group and the emerging new global groups, what kind of credibility do they have? Do they have the kind of weight and heft and scientific research behind it that would be a good vehicle for Britain to go and use?
Well, not as it stands at the moment, because they don't. It's not formal. But there's no reason why the bilateral and trilateral collaborations that exist globally anyway couldn't be brought into a broader union along the lines suggested. But it doesn't negate the importance of putting in place the real agreements that we need to put in place between now and exiting Euratom. I mean, that's the priority, first and foremost. Anything else that brings together, a collaboration of the willing, all to the good.
It doesn't solve the issue. It's potentially maybe something interesting and worthwhile exploring, at a later date or over a longer period. But it doesn't solve the fundamental issues about ensuring that what we have currently is properly replicated in bilateral arrangements to enable nuclear trade and activity to continue. That grouping that's been suggested wouldn't do that.
Thank you. Rupert, my final question is directly to you. Does the Great Repeal Bill, in your view, take into consideration the needs to grandfather the laws and the regulations from Euratom directly into UK law?
Yes, it does. In relation to those which are directly applicable, which are the directives, and obviously then the regulations, they are intended to be continual, but that doesn't protect the safeguards arrangements and those things which are within domestic law.
And are there laws that are currently, or regulations currently being passed in the Euratom process, which we would, once we leave, that are in motion at the moment, that we wouldn't take into?
Yes, there are, and David Singh has referred to the 3 directives, and they are developing and changing as experience would expect them to. And we will have to replicate those in some way, shape or form to reach that first base where we can state to be compliant and then approaching the NSC counterparties that we have. Then to me the challenge is to identify that dozens or so counterparties around the world including Euratom as a whole, whom we must arrive at with an arrangement as quickly as possible. It won't be within 2 years. That's the danger.
Thank you.
And the reality.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Amanda.
Thank you, Chair. I also have two short questions, although I have a sneaky suspicion the second question could be another hour's debate.
No, it won't.
So it will have to be brief answers. Just in terms of members of Euratom's kind of views on nuclear, it's quite wide-ranging. And so I suppose one of the things I'm just interested in, if we leave Euratom, what does that mean in terms of policy, and is there likely to be a change of direction? And the subsequent question to that is, what does it mean for us?
So you mean change of direction within Euratom?
Yeah. So because we're not there to kind of have that direct influence, so what does that mean?
Well, there's in that wider community, there's a balance of different views. You have to be a member of Euratom if you're a member of the European community. So Austria, for example, has already been mentioned as a state which doesn't have an interest in nuclear, is a member of Euratom. So the balance will be different within Euratom. But I suppose that's slightly different from the function that we're talking about, the functions that are currently either happen with Euratom or through that Euratom framework, which is sort of different from the overall balance of views within that group of states working together. But the balance will be different because we're a significant size of member state, and therefore size of membership within Euratom would be outside of it.
So there are other implications of that?
No, go on.
I mean, one example would be there is currently an NSC, a nuclear cooperation agreement, between America and Euratom. If you take the United Kingdom out of Euratom, then you leave, for example, Germany and Austria, who may be less interested in cooperation with the States, or may see the United Kingdom as similar to the States, i.e. as a nuclear power, who are covertly maybe seen as a threat to the EU, and they won't want to negotiate an agreement. Without the UK being inside, it's quite possible that will not be possible because Germany doesn't want it to happen. Those are the sort of practical problems.
We have been a key player. And indeed, one of the groups I've mentioned, the European Nuclear Safety Regulators Group, we were chair of that group for a 2-year period up until about 12 months ago. We've recently, our Chief Nuclear Inspector has now been appointed as Vice Chair to that group. So we have been a big player actually, and we have been a very influential player in relation to Euratom and its working groups. So our presence would be missed actually, is probably the best way of describing it. And that could shift the balance, the policy position.
I mean, it may not affect the actions of individual member states because that is, the decision as to whether or not you have nuclear energy as part of your energy mix or not is down to each member state to decide. So, it's not likely to affect those views. Those member states that intend to replace their nuclear power stations or to invest in new stations if they haven't been nuclear energy nations in the future will still continue to do that.
I am conscious of time, so just one other quick question. We talked a lot about Euratom, but that is just one part of Brexit. And I'm just wondering if there's any other kind of priorities that the government should be looking at in terms of the nuclear industry as we leave the EU.
There are a whole range of things that affect the nuclear industry, the wider energy industry and industry generally, which I'm sure you've touched on with others in relation to freedom of movement, tariffs, all those types of trading issues, and that will depend on the outcome of those wider negotiations, the situation we're in, but that will have an impact, potentially have an impact. So there are wider issues around the EU single energy market, which again I'm sure you've discussed with others. There's a whole range of issues which will have an impact on the nuclear industry in the same way as they will on very many others, as well as the specifics that are within the Euratom part of it, which is obviously specific to nuclear.
I've already mentioned skills, particularly movement with respect to students, postgrads, postdocs, high-end academic staff. I mean, that applies right across the board in the science and engineering sector, not just to nuclear.
Thank you very much. That was very comprehensive and incredibly insightful, so thank you again.